a symbol of new life, of passionate love. An age-old inspiration to artists and poets, a symbol of God. Constantly reinventing herself, the tulip has enchanted sultans and intrigued botanists. A flower like no other, she has the power to capture hearts and break them. She's the symbol of two nations. In the Netherlands, during the crazed years of the tulipomania, she delivered riches beyond all dreams. In Turkey, under the Ottoman Sultan Hikmet III, she brings an empire to its knees. But to understand how a simple flower shaped destinies and influenced the face of history, we have to go back to its very origins. The majestic rocky crags of Pamir. With hundreds of summits reaching over 5,000 meters, they form the rugged backbone of Central Asia and one of the most inhospitable regions on Earth. Thousands of years ago, this rugged mountain barrier was the reason that the ancient civilizations of Rome and China remained almost unaware of each other's existence. Today it's the place where China and Tibet meet Tajikistan and Afghanistan. Conditions here are extreme. Barren soil, lung-searing air, fierce, icy winds, the severest of winters and dry, hot summers. But here in this kingdom of rock and ice, the first tulip springs into life some 15 million years ago. This beautiful miniature flower carries her petals a scant few inches from the ground. Though tiny, she's tough and exceptionally well adapted to her mountain home, whose harshness has given her an extraordinary capacity for diversity. All she needs, in fact, to take on the world. But the tulip has to wait for millions of years before escaping her lonely home. Then one day, her world changes forever. It takes the hardiest people to conquer her inaccessible home of rock and snow. Turkish nomads. Raiding and trading, they advance steadily through the steppes of Central Asia. At the end of a harsh winter, they welcome their ravishing wild flower as the herald of a new spring. They see in her a symbol of new life and fertility, and celebrate, as people still do today, the change of season with music and dance. As a treasured symbol, the tulip is carried by the Turkish nomads across the endless steppes.
Bulbs began to move slowly westward 2,000 or 3,000 years ago perhaps, and they would have been carried perhaps in the luggage of nomads who were moving to the west. They reached India certainly, and also the shores of the Black Sea and the eastern reaches of Anatolia, the first century of the Christian era.
Over time, settlements and trade routes linking China with the West develop into a huge network, the Great Silk Route. For thousands of years, ideas and goods are carried between the two continents. Among these, the tulip. Her hardy little bulb is easy to carry and survives well the long journeys. Through contact with people, the tulip has found an ideal way to begin her conquest of the world. In Persia, the tulip develops great symbolic importance and is planted in great swaths in the gardens of the capital Isfahan. Her delicacy inspires artists who use the tulip as a decoration on clothing and fine jewelry. Her beauty inspires writers and poets. One verse often ascribed to the great Ömer Hayyam uses the tulip as a metaphor for flawless female beauty. Look at my face as if a magnificent tulip. Look at my body as if a thin stem. Sculptor giving life to me from dust granules, unknown why he created me. The tulip's delicacy and beauty had enchanted the Persians, but her most enduring love affair was yet to come. It began with the Seljuks, a Turkish clan from Mongolia who developed a Roman taste for empire. Ruled by 3 warlords, they sweep west, destroying the Byzantine hold on Asia Minor and conquering the city of Iconium, known today as Konya in central Turkey. Inspired by the achievements of Rome, they name their conquered lands the Sultanate of Rum and settle into the cities they capture, bringing with them their beloved tulip. Merging their own traditions with those of Byzantine, the Seljuks turn their hand to building an empire. And as it grows, so does their veneration for the tulip, which soon comes to bloom in profusion on their palace walls. One of the earliest known drawings of a tulip is found on a 12th century Seljuk tile, excavated from the site of the mighty Aladdin Palace. Under the Seljuks, Konya becomes an important intellectual center, drawing the greatest thinkers in the world to the city. One of them is the Persian philosopher Mevlana. As a mystic of Islam, he preaches unlimited tolerance, positive reasoning, and awareness through love. He teaches that there's truth in every religion. Appealing to men of all creeds, Mevlana's spiritual tolerance has an important influence on Islam and society. His followers establish a religious order, the Dancing Dervishes, named after the dance ritual which Mevlana performs as a way of reaching an enlightened ecstatic state of oneness with Allah. Islam is a religion of the desert, and its vision of paradise is a garden filled with fountains and carpeted with beautiful flowers. Mevlana's poetry sings of the tulip, the holiest of all the blooms in a Muslim garden. The tulip by now is regarded as a flower of God, because in Arabic script, the letters that make up the word lale, the Turkish word for tulip, are the same as those that form Allah. But this flower of God could not save their Sultanate of Rum. By the middle of the 13th century, the Seljuk Empire has fallen. Out of the ensuing chaos, a new warlord emerges, known as Osman. his descendants, the Osmanlis, known in Europe as the Ottomans, will rule what will become the Ottoman Empire for more than 7 centuries, opening up for their beloved flower a host of new opportunities. In the 14th century, the flower of God makes her entrance on the battlefield. In a campaign launched by Sultan Murad I against the Christians in the Balkans. By now, the Islamic ban on the portrayal of living things is in full force, and pictures of the tulip are no longer shown in public. In the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, the Sultan's second son, Bayezid, secretly wears a shirt embroidered with tulips hidden beneath his armor. He hopes they'll bring him through battle safely.
At that time, Bayezid, the Thunderbolt, was one of the major Turkish generals fighting in that battle, and in fact when his father was assassinated by a Serb in the course of the battle, he took over the command of the Turkish armies and was crowned Sultan on the battlefield.
Bayezid believes the tulip talisman has done her work. The Ottoman Empire is now established on both sides of the Bosphorus, and the tulip has gained her first tentative toehold in Europe. For 13 long years, Bayezid triumphs in every campaign, until his defeat and capture by the Mongol general Timur in the Battle of Ankara. Confined to a cage, Bayezid is humiliated and ends up committing suicide. Although the tulip cannot prevent the Sultan's tragic end, this does not affect her growing popularity. As the Islamic ban on images of living things relaxes, numerous portraits of the tulip begin to show up. The flower is depicted on sultans' kaftans, and on the battlefield, tulip talismans appear in full view on the armor. The tulip sprouts on soldiers' helmets. The general's horses get dazzling gold-plated headplates, with tulips as the central motif. This piece features elegant tulip engravings right and left of the tree of life, the symbol of immortality. For centuries, Ottoman sultans viewed Constantinople, the great capital of the Christian Byzantine Empire, as the ultimate prize. Behind these mighty walls lay the richest city in the world. For almost 1,000 years, armies from Persia, Arabia and Russia had tried unsuccessfully to lay their hands on these riches. Then in 1453, Constantinople meets its match in Sultan Mehmed II. Drawn not only by its riches, but by its strategic hold over water and trade routes, Mehmed II sees the city as the ideal capital for a new empire. The siege begins as an army of 170,000 Ottoman warriors surround the city. Mehmed's artillery begins the bombardment with a battery of catapults. For 54 days, his army pounds the city's defenses. Then, early one morning, the Turks break through the walls, and Constantinople falls to the conqueror. The 1,000-year reign of the Byzantine Empire comes to an end. A shockwave spreads out across Europe, The greatest city in the Christian world is now the capital of the Ottoman Empire, and in the process renamed Istanbul. On one of the city's 7 hills, where the Bosphorus and Golden Horn waterways meet, Mehmed the Conqueror builds himself a magnificent new palace, the Topkapi Saray, the grand new home of the tulip. Mehmed is a learned man, raised by his Greek-Byzantine mother to embrace many cultures. He has great plans for his new capital. Istanbul is to be restored to the eminence it once had. The great Byzantine church of Hagia Sophia, used for Christian worship for over 500 years, is converted into a mosque. 4 minarets are erected at the corners of this marvel of the ancient world. Inside the 184-foot-high dome, shields inscribed with the names of the prophets and Quran verses are placed. The Byzantine mosaics are all carefully covered in plaster, preserving them perfectly until their restoration in 1935. Mehmed is not only an enlightened sultan, he's also a passionate gardener and devoted to his tulips. At a time when gardens with ornamental plants and flowers don't yet exist in Europe, the Sultan enjoys 61 private pleasure gardens designed to seduce the eye. Many lie scattered along the shores of the Bosphorus. To fill these, Mehmed orders every part of the Ottoman Empire to be searched for new varieties. And wild tulips are brought in from Crimea, the Aegean Islands and Syria. But it won't be for another 200 years that this seductive flower would get its next big opportunity. Suleiman the Magnificent is like his great-grandfather Mehmed II. He's a savage warrior on the battlefield and a tulip lover in the palace. Under his reign, gardeners at the court rise to high rank. They're all well trained in the palace school and expert florists. Gardeners believe that by growing the flower of God, they assure themselves a place in heaven. But these court gardeners are given a strange mix of duties, including providing cut flowers for the imperial quarters to carrying out executions. The tread of the red-capped gardeners through the palace courtyards often preceded ritual strangulation with a silk cord for the higher ranks, or death by the sword for the common Ottoman subjects. The man who's both head of the imperial gardens and the most senior religious man in court is Sheikhul Islam Ebu Sud Effendi. With his passion for tulips, he's the first gardener to devote himself entirely to the flower. His crossbreeding experiments show for the first time a scientific approach. At the time, little is known about how to propagate flowers, and new varieties are produced more by luck than by judgment. Yet Ebu Sud and his gardeners spend months working on his beloved flower. Although the details of his tulip experiments remain shrouded in mystery, we know that over the years, Ebu Sud manages to draw from the magical flower a whole range of new colors and forms. Collectively, these become known as the Istanbul Tulip. Very different from the short-stemmed wild tulips, this new flower is almond-shaped, with its petals ending in slender pointed tips. Along the way, Ebu Sud has also laid the foundation for a first scientific classification system for the tulip. The magnificent Topkapi Palace gardens develop under Sultan Süleyman the Magnificent to show off the grandeur and wealth of the man who now calls himself God's shadow on earth. By the mid-1500s, the Ottoman Empire reaches the zenith of its political and military power, reaching into Eastern Europe and North Africa, again opening up new possibilities for the tulip. At home, Süleyman initiates a renaissance, surpassing his great-grandfather's passion for the tulip. He dresses in robes graced with elegant designs of the flower. The Sultan's devotion to the tulip turns it into a favorite motif of the nakkaş, the artists of the imperial studios. Mosques are also decorated with images of the tulip. The Grand Vizier dared not build the Rustam Pasha Mosque any larger than that of the Sultan, but he made sure it was more lavishly decorated, using tiles painted in 41 different tulip motifs from the famous workshops in Iznik. A rage for the flower develops, and she becomes recognized throughout the empire as a symbol of Ottoman wealth and power. Enchanted by the flower's beauty, artisans find ways to include tulips in all manner of arts and crafts.
The great success that the Ottoman Turks had in expanding their empire during the 16th century did bring Europeans into the empire really for the first time. The major European powers, the Austrians, the French, began to send ambassadors to Istanbul, seeking alliances with the Turks, seeking some assurance perhaps that their imperial aspirations were not directed at them.
Nederland is nog deel van het keizerrijk.
The Netherlands were still a part of the empire of Charles V.
En Karel V
And Charles V had diplomats in his service, one of whom he sends to Turkey, to the Turkish Sultan Süleyman Kanuni. These diplomats were Flemish and Dutch. They were humanists and educated men. And one of them was Ogier Gislaan de Busbecq. Busbecq became famous because he brought with him souvenirs from Turkey.
While on his way from Vienna to Istanbul, the Busbecq spots just outside the town of Edirne a man walking along the road with a beautiful wild flower stuck in his headdress. The Busbecq points at the flower and asks its name. Assuming the ambassador is referring to the headdress, the interpreter answers tulipan, the Turkish word for turban. It's thought that the word tulip is the result of that misunderstanding between the ambassador and his interpreter.
Busbecq verzamelt overal planten.
Busbecq collected plants everywhere. He was interested in the flora and fauna of Turkey. He arrived in Amasya, met the Sultan, and as a successful ambassador made peace with him, and then returned. He brought seeds with him, tulip bulbs and hyacinth bulbs, and he brought lilac and chestnut seeds. He had a good friend, the court botanist for the emperor in Vienna, Carolus Clusius.
On his return to Vienna, Busbecq gives tulip bulbs to his friend Clusius, who's head of the imperial gardens. Busbek writes of his experiences in the exotic Ottoman Empire, noting in particular the Turkish passion for the tulip and their remarkable skills in growing them. As Clusius begins cultivating his tulips, bulbs begin to move from Turkey to the rest of Europe via the brisk trade routes now developing.
Some of them certainly began to reach Western Europe in the cargoes of ships that had called in Istanbul, which was of course at that time the major trading port for goods coming from the east towards Europe. In the 1570s, the first bulbs that appeared in the Low Countries, Belgium and the Netherlands, seem to have entered those countries by sea on ships coming from Istanbul.
In the harbour of Antwerp in northern Belgium, a local cloth merchant receives a strange gift from a Turkish colleague: tulip bulbs. Thinking that they're a variety of Turkish onion, the merchant eats most of the bulbs for his supper, planting the rest in his kitchen garden next to the cabbages. A big surprise awaits him in spring. Meanwhile, the tulips that Clusius cultivates in Vienna have begun to spread through Europe. On his long travels searching out rare plants, Clusius meets many gardeners and botanists, with whom he develops a lively correspondence, often sending out new varieties for them to cultivate in their own gardens. In 1593, Clusius moves to the Netherlands to escape the rigid religious atmosphere in Vienna. He's already 67 years old when he arrives with his tulips in the city of Leiden to become the head of the botanical gardens. Behind him lies a long and distinguished career. He has studied both natural sciences and medicine in universities throughout Europe. Fluent in 7 languages, he writes and translates for other botanists and tutors the sons of nobility. At the Hortus, Clusius plants his collection of rare tulips in a small garden behind the university building and devotes himself entirely to the beautiful flower. The tulip arrives in the Netherlands at just the right time. The economy is booming, and the Dutch are exchanging their old values of thrift and soberness for display and luxury.
Certainly by the turn of the 17th century, the tulip was well established in Holland. And this was at a time when the Dutch themselves were becoming considerably more wealthy. They had, around about the 1600, established a trade with the East Indies in spices. And this was by far the wealthiest, the richest trade that existed in the world at that time. And the Dutch, as a result, became extremely wealthy. By the 1620s, Holland was probably the wealthiest country in Northern Europe. And the merchants themselves, who had profited from this trade, had a vast amount of money, and they were interested in disposing of it in terms of establishing beautiful new country houses and developing exotic gardens, which they used essentially as status symbols to show how wealthy they were and how much money they could afford to spend on such non-essential items.
The tulip is in vogue. She's become a symbol of wealth and prestige. But in a country embracing both Calvinism and humanism, people are searching for a balance between greed and devotion.
The Dutch were very fond of moralizing about the briefness of life and the importance of heaven and all that, and how you might love your earthly possessions. And they had wonderful possessions. It was a very rich country because of the empire. But you must remember that those possessions are meaningless in the eyes of God. And a tulip was a symbol for that, a perfect symbol, a beautiful, beautiful flower, but in front of you it died and shed its petals and showed that all life is fragile.
Tulips of all colours emerge, but the bicoloured ones are favourites.
The Dutch were particularly taken by bulbs which had been infected by a strain of virus called the mosaic virus. And one of the side effects of this illness, this disease, was to make the tulips themselves far more dramatically colourful.
if the Dutch had known that, they would have found that a wonderful moral lesson, because they would say that, you know, what is most diseased is the most evil is the most valued and prized in this world.
In 1601, Clusius publishes what is generally regarded as the first scientific treatise on the tulip, the Rariorum Plantarum Historia, inspired in part by the tulip classification system developed by the Turk Ebusud. He separates for the first time the rare and desirable tulips from the more common and worthless. At that time, European botanists only really valued plants that were edible or used as a medicine. Clusius divides the rarest flame tulips into 3 select groups: the rosen, which are red and pink on a white ground, the violet, lilac and purple on a white ground, and the bizarden, red or violet on a yellow ground. By far the rarest flower at the time is known as Semper Augustus. She's a particularly fine rosen tulip, blooming with a white flower with very fine red scarlet flakes of color shooting up the center of the petals and edging it. Around 1629, there are only about a dozen examples of this tulip in existence.
They were all in the possession of a single merchant who was an inhabitant of Amsterdam, and he was offered sums of up to 10,000 guilders for a single bulb. Now at this time it was possible for an entire family to be fed, clothed and housed in Amsterdam for around about 250 guilders a year. You could buy a house on the best canal in Amsterdam, the finest location, for that sort of sum of money. And so we're talking about a flower which is worth around about the cost of a huge mansion in Amsterdam, essentially.
The owner of the Semper Augustus refuses to sell, pushing her price up further. And when the tulip is finally sold, she moves for the extraordinary sum of 12,000 guilders per bulb. These extreme prices start to attract the interest of the less wealthy. The more common tulips are much cheaper, making them available for artisans and the poor to buy.
And it's very easy to understand how the idea that one could, for example, rather than work as a blacksmith all the hours of the day, simply plant a few bulbs in the ground, wait for them to grow, water them occasionally perhaps, but essentially sit back and watch your investment develop. As tulips became more widely available, a few men would take bulbs, plant them, grow them, and then sell them when they were ready to flower the next year and pocket the profit. Often, of course, they would then reinvest this money in buying slightly more valuable tulip bulbs, and so gradually a trade developed.
But as the bulb trade becomes more professional, tulip traders are faced with a difficulty. For most of the year, the precious objects they're selling look just like small brown onions, giving nothing away of the beauty of the flower it contains, or the value it might have. To get around this, traders commission eminent artists to paint beautiful portraits of blooms in watercolor or gouache. These are used as sale catalogues to show prospective customers the kind of flower they can expect to see in the spring. One such album is known today as Judith Leister's Tulip Book. She was one of the few female master painters of her time and had served her apprenticeship with the famous painter Frans Hals.
The masters of flower paintings would sell their paintings for a large amount of money, and tulips were again the most prized flowers in the bouquets. They would have mixed bouquets of columbines and roses and lilies and all sorts of flowers, but the tulips had the pride of place in the flower arrangements because they were the most expensive, valuable flowers. And so if you had tulips in the painting, you may not be able to afford them in real life, but you could have a painting of them. Because the Dutch were this moralistic people, often the paintings would have signs in them of the shortness of life. So they would have a caterpillar eating the leaves, or they'd have a snail eating away at the blossoms. sometimes they would have dewdrops or bubbles, which are symbols of the fragility of life. So there would be a little moral lesson in the paintings. The flower paintings were very, very beautiful, and they changed hands for a lot of money, but not nearly as much money as the most expensive tulips. And so the irony nowadays is that these Dutch flower paintings now cost hundreds of thousands of pounds, very, very valuable paintings. But then one tulip would cost more than the most expensive painting.
Around the late autumn of 1636, a genuine mania for tulip develops in the Netherlands. According to one account of the time, the idle rich lost their wealth and the wise lost their senses. Represented here as the Roman goddess Flora, the tulip is now selling herself to the highest bidder. But because her price is constantly rising, no man can afford to keep her for long, for each new lover is richer than the last. More and more people fall under a spell, buying and selling her bulbs at an increasingly rapid rate.
When the craze for gambling started to grip the whole nation, and it gripped everybody, it gripped the low classes, the high classes, the middle classes, everyone joined together in this hysteria. When it got very dangerous was when they started gambling on tulip futures.
It became commonplace, in fact, for bulbs not to be sold in any physical sense at all, but simply for pieces of paper denoting the ownership of a particular bulb to be exchanged by tulip dealers who were working, in most cases, in the back rooms of pubs and taverns, often in a drunken haze, and a certain amount of excitement was prevalent, and the trade became really far more extensive and exciting, and often a bulb might be exchanged 10 times in the period of 1 or 2 days. It became, in fact, very difficult to trace the ownership of any particular bulb, and in many cases it may be that flowers that didn't really exist began to be traded, and certainly the value of even the most normal tulips began to really increase at a very rapid rate. This was a catastrophic situation because 1 or 2 men began to think that they might actually sell tulips rather than buy them. And as soon as the first of those trades were put together, confidence in the tulip market collapsed. Prices fell overnight throughout the Netherlands, essentially over, in a period of a few days. They crashed to around about 1 to 5% of their previous value. Now, to put that in some sort of context, the Wall Street crash of 1929, which is probably the most famous example of a bubble bursting, resulted in share prices in the United States falling by 3/4 over a period of 4 years. So for prices in the Netherlands for tulip bulbs to collapse by 95% in the period of 1 or 2 weeks is really a catastrophe almost unmatched in history.
Their lives were ruined by it. People made huge fortunes, but they lost vast, vast fortunes, and they threw themselves into the canals in Amsterdam and drowned and despaired. So in 1636 or early 1637, the government stepped in and stopped it.
The government's decision is a wise one. The fledgling flower industry contracts, leaving only the largest growers catering to a small market of connoisseurs. It would be 100 years before business got going again, and then on a scale never seen before. Their client will be the young Ottoman Sultan Hikmet III. His reign would become known as the Lale Devri, or the Tulip era. In the 1720s, after more than 4 centuries of conquest and defeat, the Ottomans turned their attention from war to pleasure. And the Istanbul Tulip regains her throne. First bred under Suleiman the Magnificent, she now boasts an entire family. With her almond-shaped, needle-pointed petals, she's very different from her hot cousins in Europe. The Turks have, however, learnt the lesson of the Dutch tulipomania. a limit is put on the number of florists and bulb prices are fixed by imperial decree. By now the tide has turned in the bulb trade between the East and the West. Tulips from Europe begin to find their way back to Istanbul. The new shapes and colours causing a sensation. And the Sultan begins to import millions of tulip bulbs from Holland to fill his imperial Ottoman gardens.
Ahmed III himself was perhaps the leading tulip mania in history. He was an absolutely passionate devotee of the tulip, and this really was something which had been born in him partly because his own father had been an extremely keen gardener and had loved tulips, but also because owing to the way in which Ottoman princes were kept in a cage essentially in the Topkapi Palace and were banned from going out of it and therefore could not experience the beauties of the fantastic gardens that existed in the Topkapi Palace. Ahmed had probably spent many years gazing out into the gardens and acquired a love of flowers as a result of, in fact, not being able to acquire or touch them.
Ottoman princes were imprisoned in the so-called cage to protect them from being killed by the many rivals to the throne. The young Ahmed spends 29 years before his father dies and he's made Sultan. It's during these long years that Ahmed develops a true obsession for the tulip. On taking the throne, one of his first deeds is to order a grand spring festival, organized around the tulip. No cost is spared, the festivities running both day and night for the 4 to 5 weeks that the flowers are in bloom. Hundreds of vases are brought out filled with breathtaking tulips, carrying poetic names like Blue Pearl, Ruby Drop, and Light of Dawn. The full extravagance of the events are wonderfully captured by the court painter Levny in these lively depictions. Breathtaking in scope, these tulip festivals become established as a much heralded annual event. The Western ambassadors in Istanbul all vie for an invitation, dazzled by the opulence of the celebrations and the lavish gifts being dispensed by the Sultan to those attending.
Of that time, Damat Ibrahim was one of the major organisers of these festivals, which he did largely to retain the favour of the Sultan, who he knew, of course, was passionate about tulips. It was obviously a very good way of finding favour with the Sultan to present him with rare tulip bulbs, and many Western ambassadors, in fact, became part of this practice and would, when they arrived at the Ottoman court, begin their period as ambassador by making a gift of tulip bulbs to the Sultan.
The Netherlands ambassador in Istanbul at the time is the Dutch aristocrat Cornelis Kalkoen. During his audiences with Sultan Ahmed III, Kalkoen stresses the friendship and trade between the Netherlands and the Ottoman Empire, building on the special relationship established between the two countries more than a century before. Sealed in lavish calligraphy in this treaty of 1612. And with the ambassadors and tulips from Europe comes a Western influence.
Now that we are in such times, the Ottoman Empire changes. The word Ottoman Barocco begins to be used by the historians, who, in this case, are right because we constantly imitate the glorious style of Western architecture.
European Rococo details emerge on mosques and palaces. At the time, private houses are largely built of wood, so highly susceptible to fire. Seeing the need, Kalkun presents the Sultan with the first fire engines seen in Istanbul, laying the basis for the modern fire brigade. With this wind from the west comes also a change in attitudes. Women lose their veils and begin to wear low necklines. They enjoy the freedom to play games, smoke, read books, and indulge themselves in all the pleasures of life, including the opulent tulip festivals.
It has been said that Ahmed's devotion to the tulip was such that it actually distracted him from the affairs of state. I think that that's probably putting matters a little bit too far, but certainly the opulence of the festivities which took place in Istanbul each year was very much in contrast to the fortunes of the Ottoman Empire at that time. Although Ahmed had had considerable success in fighting the Russians, he was doing very badly in a war that was taking place against the Persians at that time. And really in Istanbul, pressures began to mount on the Turkish government.
The Ottoman economy is almost entirely based on war. Without the spoils of battle flowing in, there's no money with which to feed the ordinary people. The elite, meanwhile, have developed a decadent taste for the lavish. And the symbol of that extravagance is the tulip. Exorbitant taxes are instated so as to pay for the conspicuous luxury of Ahmed's imperial court.
An economical fact emerges. The merchants are discontented. Why? Because the emperor and his vizier are into luxury and they don't lead their armies into war. The input necessary to run the market, and the economy vanishes into the walls of the palace.
While the Sultan's subjects run out of money to buy even the most basic things, trade grinds to a halt and the people go hungry. Widespread discontent stirs in the streets. Bakers, fruit sellers, butchers, cobblers all join in large protest marches. Then news of imperial defeats in the war against Persia reaches Istanbul. A large-scale revolt against the Sultan and his Grand Vizier erupts, led by Patrona Halil, a member of the Imperial Guard. In the course of the subsequent rampage, rioters storm the palaces and kill leading Ottoman dignitaries. Sultan Ahmed III is forced from the throne after ordering the execution of his Grand Vizier, Damad Ibrahim, the mastermind behind the lavish tulip festivals. Then his precious gardens are dug up and set on fire. Seen as a symbol of his decadent extravagance, thousands of tulips are destroyed. The tulip era is brought abruptly to an end, and all 1,300 varieties of the ravishingly delicate Istanbul tulip slowly fade from memory.
Aşağı yukarı 150 sene.
What happened to the Ottoman tulip, grown for about 150 years? Unfortunately, the Ottoman tulip didn't survive up to this day. Is it possible to breed the Ottoman tulip again? Unfortunately, we don't know what kinds of tulips were used to crossbreed, and there's no publication on this issue.
Today they live on only in the pages of a poetry book, on a tile in a mosque, or on a gravestone. But in the Netherlands, the passion for the tulip survives unabated. And since the end of the 16th century, this country has grown and exported them in increasing quantities to the rest of the world. Today, the Netherlands dominates a multi-million-dollar international export business. In fact, more than 3/4 of the tulips in the world are raised in these fields. New techniques have brought about new possibilities. Thanks to careful manipulation of light and temperature, tulips can now be made to bloom at any time of the year, boosting dramatically the cut flower trade, which has become far more lucrative than the one producing bulbs. But the result is that more than half of the tulip fields in Holland are planted with just 20 cultivars, a sad constraint on a flower equipped by nature with more than 1,000 expressions. Yet in many respects, the tulip today has achieved all she set out to do. In her countless guises, she's now found all over the world. Both the Netherlands and Turkey still share a passion for the flower and count her as a national symbol. A symbol also of more than 400 years of friendship and trade. The mysterious Istanbul Tulip is no more, but interest in reviving her graceful, slender form is growing. Who knows, in the not-too-distant future, she may be found again in the gardens of the Imperial Palace of Topkapi, and her old home will be lit up again by the light of the East.